Hello and welcome to episode 223 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Luke. Damien, how you doing?
I'm brilliant, Andy. I won't go on about football this week, but all I want to say is I'm going to the Champions League final. And that is it. I'll finish there and won't mention any more.
What a couple of weeks. FA Cup final this weekend for Andy, me. What did I call myself, Andy?
You talked about yourself in the third person there. Yeah. You told me off earlier on when I did it. So yeah, you've come down to my level. But FA Cup final for you tomorrow, Andy.
I know, and Champions League for you next week. We could have 2 trophies for our 2 teams when we talk sort of in a couple of weeks' time. So that is incredible. I don't know what to do with myself.
I will watch the FA Cup final, Andy, this week, just because I want Watford to win like everybody else does, and obviously Tottenham the week after.
Oh, can I put some posts on our Instagram?
You can do a takeover for a day. Yeah, do an Andy takeover. Will you paint your face?
I have done for the previous finals, but I think with this facial hair, it's not going to work.
Well, I suppose the previous finals were 30 years ago, so you didn't have facial hair.
No, but I had far more face to cover, so it'll be cheaper to do it this time.
Okay, so yeah, Andy, you can do the takeover on the weekend. So if you've seen this or listened to this podcast, go and look at our Instagram.
Yeah, and you'll see either a happy or a very, very sad face. Right, enough of the football. We said we weren't going to talk about football. Then we spent 2 minutes on football. What have we got coming up on the pod this week?
Right, this week I am doing a piece on mortgages. So about self-employed people and mortgages. So self-employed people often perceive it to be difficult to get a mortgage and therefore don't bother, particularly if they want to remortgage. And so I want to give them a little ray of sunshine in that regard. I want to talk about things to check when you're buying a house. I mentioned that I might do it a couple of weeks ago. People have got in touch to ask me, and it was just quite timely because I mentioned I had new neighbours, and I actually spoke to them, and they turned around and said a couple of things. Oh, we never even bothered to check that have since become, they're not issues, but they're things they probably wish they'd known, which were, in hindsight, blindingly obvious had they looked. But in the excitement to buy a house that they really like, they didn't look at them. So that's one other thing. And the final piece is on pensions. So on pensions, I want to talk about the contribution rule. So you may have heard about a rule that states that you should put away half of your age as a contribution each month. So if you're 40 years old, you should be putting away 20% of your salary into a pension. And whether that works, it's a conventional wisdom, and we're going to put it to the test.
Good. So what are we going to start with?
Let's start with the mortgage stuff. Actually, before I do that, just a quick mention on something I spoke about last week, which was kind of to do with low cost investing and lifestyling. I'm not plugging products, but just to make people aware, Vanguard do a version of a kind of lifestyling fund, something called a target retirement fund. Go and have a look at it. If you liked last week's piece on how you reduce your risk in your portfolio as you move towards retirement, then they have some low cost tracker funds, but they also have this range that are aimed at doing something very similar for you. So go and have a look at that. Just an FYI, really. But mortgages. Now, Trussell, who are they're an online mortgage broker, just like Habito and one or two others. Now, they did a press release talking about the problems that people who are self-employed that they have getting a mortgage. And one of the stats that they produced in that press piece was about 71% of self-employed people believed it was difficult to get a mortgage. Now, that is partly true. It is more difficult than somebody who is just employed. But we want to give you a little bit of ray of sunshine, a little bit of hope if you're listening, you're self-employed and pondering buying a house, or you're thinking of remortgaging, because it will impact about 4.9 million people. That's the stat on the number of people who are freelancing, self-employed. So it's a lot of people.
It's a huge amount. That surprises me.
So if you're looking to get a mortgage and you're employed, it is a more simple task. So what the mortgage broker will do is they'll look at your income, your expenditure, and they will decide whether they're going to lend to you. And you'll be looking for the best rate or the cheapest deal overall, taking account of fees. So it's a slightly easier journey. It doesn't mean you're not going to provide proof of all these things, but it is a far easier journey than if you are self-employed. And that's because if you are self-employed, you have got basically lumpy earnings. You may have earnings that fluctuate So it's harder for you to actually prove your income because you don't have a pay slip every month because you are basically the boss. So what tends to happen is that mortgage companies will want something like 3 years of accounts to support any application for a mortgage. So as well as your sort of income and expenditure, they want proof of that income via these accounts. But the difficulty is about a third of borrowers actually find it difficult to find that information. And so 3 years accounts is quite a lot. So the ray of hope for people is that there are some lenders out there who will now only take 1 year's worth of accounts. So Halifax is one such lender. So even if you've got a very short business, so you've only been around for a short period of time because you've just launched it, you've just left the job, because I recall actually going back a step, just talking as an individual, when I started Money to the Masses, one of the issues that I would have had as, personally was going from an employed world to suddenly going to a world where I was going to be generating my own income, so self-employed or eventually employed, becoming limited companies and things like that. I had to sit there and think, did I ever want to borrow money before I did that? Because once I became self-employed at the very start, it was going to be far more difficult. And that, unfortunately, is something you need to bear in mind. If you're about to quit an employed job and you want to build a massive extension, it may be worth trying to get the money, or be easier to get the money and the mortgage before you quit your job. But that's just a sort of side tip there. So yeah, some places people will give you a mortgage based on 1 year accounts, but there are some that will consider 9 months worth of accounts, but it would need to be supported by accounts drawn up by your accountants or qualified accountants. So there is hope. If you're listening to this, you don't have to think you aren't going to be able to get a mortgage for 3 years. Now, the other issue for self-employed people is what counts as income. Now, if you're a sole trader, then it's basically profits. So profits that would have been disclosed via your tax return. And that would be typically averaged over about 3 years. Whereas if you're a limited company, then what they will do is they will start to look at your salary. So you probably pay yourself a basic salary if you're a limited company, plus you take dividends to top that up. And that's because it's one of the most tax efficient ways to take money out of a business. But if you do that, then some lenders will only take into account salary and dividends, but some will also take into account retained profits, so your share of the profits that are in the business. And that's particularly relevant if you have more than one director of the business, because not all of the retained profits will be yours. So the message of this piece is that if you are self-employed, then you can get a mortgage. There are options out there for you, but it becomes less about just looking for the cheapest rate and trying to get the cheapest deal. It starts becoming more about trying to find somebody who will lend to you based on your circumstances. So as ever, it's definitely a scenario where you would need to go and speak to a mortgage broker. It's the best thing you can do, because if you don't, then you'll just be banging your head against a brick wall going from lender to lender, who won't probably lend to you because they want all sorts of criteria and documentation which you probably don't have. So again, speak to a mortgage broker and they will be able to tell you straight away, a bit like I said about Halifax, who might be able to lend to you and therefore make it a reality.
Good. So if you're self-employed, you've got that mortgage source. And the next thing is to buy a house, I suppose. And we're going to cover something on
it's a good time of year to cover house bits and pieces, because it's when the market traditionally starts to pick up. It's normally around the sort of Easter time, and you go and look at a house, you find your dream home and you're in a rush to buy it, and you overlook certain things. And anyone who's bought a house will know exactly what I'm talking about. And funny enough, what kind of inspired this, because I started talking to my new neighbours. And you know, as you do in sort of suburbia, you start talking over your fence to the people next door, and then they start chatting away about the house they bought, which is a nice house and it's in a nice condition. And then they pointed out, which was an obvious thing to me because I obviously noticed it, they didn't realise they had no access to their back garden. So I live in a terraced road. They didn't realise. I went, I've just realised, how do we get in our back garden? And the answer is they don't, because the house, the neighbour the other side of them, had built over their access way to their property, and actually they were meant to have access through the bottom of that garden. If they looked at their plans, they would have seen that, but they've therefore got a potential nightmare on their hands, as they would have to get their new neighbour that they moved into to basically tear up his garden, tear down his fences, and allow a pathway across his garden again, as it was when the house was built 120 years ago. And of course, over time, people just land grab. And so I sort of pointed that out to them and said, well, do you know what? You don't really need it. You can go through your house with the stuff that you need. And their exact words were, yeah, do you know what? We were so excited about it, we didn't really think about, I don't know, we just didn't think about that. So this piece is one that I want to just throw out a range of things to potentially look out for. This comes from a much bigger piece that we did. It was the 41 things to check when you look for a house. You can find it on the Money to Masses website. It's part of a larger checklist you can download of 89 things, but I'm going to throw it out there.
I'll link to it in the podcast notes as well.
And if I'm going to assume that you've done the checks of that, you like the area, it's got the schools for your kids, it's got you've looked at the sort of local crime rate and that sort of stuff.
And the flooding stuff, that's all covered.
Yeah, well, we did that a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
We did that. We said some great sites you can look at. So go back a couple of podcasts. There's some really good things, but this is more about the house itself. And one of the things to do is go and check where you're gonna live at different times of day, and you'll get a real feel for what the environment's like. So at weekends, in the evenings, because I'll give you a story about my house. When I moved into it, it was you go there during the day, it seems incredibly quiet. My street seems like there's nobody there because everybody leaves it to go to work. Come in the evening, do you think you'll be able to get parked? You're never going to get parked. And a couple of years ago, you used to have the kids just playing in the streets as well. So if you don't like that kind of thing, then if you'd only gone and visited the house during the day or maybe at the weekend, you wouldn't have seen things that were potentially problematic.
Is that a stress for you, by the way? When you go out and you think to yourself, oh, I really can't be bothered to try and find a parking space. Does it impact your decisions sometimes?
Yeah. I mean, we get used to it because my wife's around all the time during the day and taking the kids and out doing things, and I work locally. So we actually move our car during the day and we tend to be parked up and don't notice it in the evening. Like anybody who's my age and ended up getting married, you don't go out all that often, so you're at home. But if we come back later, oh yeah, I could be parking like 3 streets away from my house and having to like carry your kids half asleep back to your house. And it eventually does drive people to complete nuts, and they'll move. My old neighbours, they moved partly because of the parking. I don't really see it myself, but that's because my life isn't impacted in that way. But it's one of the things to think about. How does the parking work? Are there permits you have to have for the car? So where I live, again, you have to have permits. That means you have to pay the council a privilege just to park outside your own house. It might not be a thing you would have thought about, but it's certainly something that you would annoy you, or you're going to have to pay going forward, because I have to pay for visitors to come along.
Well, that's it. If you're a social butterfly and you sort of, you like hosting and you constantly got the barbecue on the go, you've got to think about those visitors and where they're going to park, I suppose.
Another thing to think about is that you might not realise that there's a school at the bottom of your road. And it might sound odd that a thing like a school, but the traffic in the morning can be a nightmare. So if you're trying to commute and get out and about, you will need to see the traffic flow at different times of the day around where you live. Because some people, again, they will be a nightmare. They won't realise that they're going to be on a rat run for a school, or for lorries to cut through to a business park and things like that. So you need to look at it at different times of day.
A good example of that is I walked to this very office past a rather big school, and it's a lovely, wide, beautiful suburban road. But you do not want to be on that road during school pick-up or drop-off, because it becomes an absolute nightmare. Honestly, it's terrible. I don't even like walking down that road because it's a nightmare, because cars are going up onto the pavements. You've got people with crossing patrols. It's dangerous.
Yeah, it is. And if you're anywhere near where we live, so southeast London, the school run, people drive their cars like they are on wacky races or something like that. Other things to think about is look at the property. Is it on a steep slope? Because sloping problems, you can get people have their garages flood. I remember, again, another story, somebody who moved into a house and didn't realise that actually the drainage into the driveway was sloped and it rolled into the house. Every time it rained or really heavily rained, their garage would flood, but they'd only seen it during the summer, so they didn't realise. Check out things like obviously the roof and any damp patches in the house. I remember other things that you walk around. I would move furniture now if I walked into a house. In my house, when I went and bought it, I look back now and it does seem a bit odd, but I walked into the bedroom of the house and there was a dressing gown strategically placed across the door. And the reason I then found out why when I moved in is because obviously the previous occupant had punched a hole through the door and had tried to strategically hide it, which he did. So go around digging those corners. Like I say, look at if the roof is in good order. Look at the decoration. Does it need redecorating? Are there any signs of damp or plaster being blown on the walls? So when you touch the walls, do they give? Because I had an issue with that. Are things like carpets in good condition? Do they need replacing? These are slightly cosmetic. One of them is electrics. Go and have a look at the electrics box. You don't need to be an electrician to sit there and look under it and go, Jesus, what's going on in here? Because if you have to rewire a house, that's going to be expensive. Does the heating system work? When was the boiler last replaced? If you're anything like my brother, he moved into his house, it was freezing cold, he went to turn the heating on and it basically didn't work. Another thing is go and look in the kitchen, check under the sinks for signs of damp, because it's a typical place, if anything like my house, where all the leaks are. Look at things like your phone signal, obviously you can broadband. Look at storage, because a lot of modern houses look fantastic but you've got nowhere to store anything. Look at the loft and the attic space so you can see whether it's got insulation, plumbing, water tank, what's going on up there, and also whether you might want to do a loft conversion, because there are people who buy houses and then they think they're going to be able to convert the loft, but they're not actually able to because of the height of the loft. So it's something to bear in mind. When you talk to the seller, you can ask them about why they're moving. They may not tell you the truth, but if you find out how long they've lived there and it's a very short period of time, then it's likely to suggest a problem somewhere along the line that they're trying to move on quickly. Find out about the neighbours. They should actually disclose whether they have a problem with the neighbours. And my new neighbour who's moved in, one of the things they didn't quite realise was my old neighbour had a problem with the people the other side.
Oh, I thought you were going to say what they didn't realise is you were the problem neighbour.
Not yet. And that's in itself can be an issue. They were so excited to get in there that they were worried about now what the other person the other side was. But that's one of those things that sometimes you're going to have to just suck it up.
I've got an issue with neighbours on my current house purchase, because I'm moving into a new build property, and it's likely when we move in we won't even have any neighbours because the house hasn't ever been sold. So I'm kind of buying and hoping, really, because there aren't any neighbours at the moment.
Yeah, so you're going to go in that world where you're going to think, this is lovely and quiet. And then you're going to get neighbours and think they're really noisy, when they're probably just going to be normal people.
Absolutely.
Going about their...
And I'm a grumpy sod anyway. So.
Yeah, you are. No, I'm only joking. So another, perhaps slightly odd one you would never think about is what's going on underground. So what's going on with the drains to your house is you are going to be responsible for it. So the sewage and everything like that. If you have a very old house, we did a podcast on it in the past, then the local water board can actually be responsible for clearing it. But the reason I mention it, if you live in a street where you are on the end of a run, like my brother was when he moved into his house, then when it backs up, it will actually back up into your house first. So he has regular problems about the drainage in the street that he's in, where people keep chucking stuff down the toilet that they shouldn't, and it backs up into his house, and he ends up having to sort out the issue. So it's something to be aware of, because you might want to have a quick look to see what's going on down there, because he had to. As he moved in, he had to shell out money to get the whole thing cleared. Quiz the estate agent, if you go to an estate agent, how long the property's been on the market, because that can be signs of problems as well. Also, you might be able to get a knockdown price because the person might be desperate to sell. And if the property is a flat, don't forget to think about things like service charges and ground rent as well, because you could get overly excited about moving in and not realise you're signing yourself up to something that you've got to pay money towards.
And with those service charge and ground rents, find out if they've got some sort of an increase locked into them, because some of them have an automatic increase of 5% each year, and even though it's affordable now, it can quickly become really expensive.
Yeah, and of course the general thing of freehold and leasehold. You need to check out about that. So that is just a sample of the 89-point checklist that we've got on Money to the Masses, which Andy will link to in the notes of this podcast. So if you want any more, you can go and download the full list.
Find out how fit your finances are for free with Damien's Money MOT. With no registration required and no need to access policies or paperwork, you'll receive your own personal grade, together with a breakdown of where you should focus your attention, all in the time that it takes to boil the kettle. Crucially, you'll get to see how you measure up compared to everyone else, and even get your own tailored plan on how to improve your score. Simply go to mot.moneytothemasses.com. So sit back, relax, take Damien's free Money MOT, go to mot.moneytothemasses.com to get started, and reward yourself with that cup of tea afterwards.
Okay, so we're going to finish off the podcast talking about pensions, and we talked about the half your age theory. Does it really work? What do we got?
So the half your age theory is a nice kind of 5 a day type of mantra that if you invest half of your age in your pension, then you will have a comfortable retirement. So that means that if you were 22 years old and you would need to invest 11% of your salary into a pension month on month, and then by the time you were 65, say, you'd have a decent pension pot. Now, Brewin Dolphin actually put that to the test and did crunch some numbers to see, does it really work? So the idea being, as you get older, then you're going to have to put more in. That's the point. So if you're 50, you'd have to put in 25% of your salary to try and play catch up. So they crunched some numbers anyway. And based on a 4% average return after charges, they came up with a range of scenarios. So a 22-year-old would have to put 11% of their salary into a pension. By the time they were 65, they would have £356,000 in their pension pot. And to give that a yearly income, it's roughly about £18,000 what they worked it out to be. Now, a 30-year-old put in 15%, they'd have slightly less, so 350,000 versus the 356 of the 22-year-old. So their annual retirement income would be slightly lower at 17,700. A 40-year-old putting in 20%. Now they would end up with 266,000, meaning they had a £13,500 retirement income. Now when you got to 50, they would have to be putting 25% of their income, and the amount that they would have by the age of 65 would be £153,000 in a pot. And that would generate, broadly speaking, something like £7,800 as an income. Now you can see that quite clearly the half your age rule isn't working, because if it was, they'd all end up at 65 with the same pot. Now if you think the average salaries are around the mid-20s, so 25 to £27,000, you can see these people are well short. Even the 22-year-old is well short. Okay, you could chuck in their state pension of about £8,700 odd on top of that, which would bring that 22-year-old a bit closer, but the 50-year-old is still way off. So what it means is that the rule doesn't work, so how could you improve it? What you'd actually have to do is between the ages of 25 and heading towards 50, it's the middle age period where it breaks down, because if you remember, the 30-year-old was still kind of on track to still be similar to the 22-year-old, but once you get to 40 and then to 50, you need to start ramping it up even more. So if you crunch the numbers, if you are 50 and you haven't done anything yet regarding pensions, you need to start putting in near 50% of your salary. So the rule goes from half your age to your actual age. And the one problem you're going to have with that is you could start bumping up to the annual contribution limits anyway, because if you have a decent salary, presumably by the time you're in your 50s and you're trying to chuck in half of that into a pension, then you might start maxing out the annual limits of around 40 grand. So to sum up, the save half your age rule doesn't work. You have to put in more as you get older. But what you really need to do is work out what you actually need to put in, because although the rules are okay, they're just generic. So we have obviously made a calculator at moneytothemasses.com. If you've never used it, the URL is calculators.moneytothemasses.com/pension, and Andy will chuck a link in the show notes. But what that calculator will do, if you put in how much you currently have in your pension, even if it's nothing, how much you can put in, your age, and various little bits of detail, then it will project your likely pension pot and your retirement income. But you can then change bits and pieces around it and try different scenarios.
What I love about it as well is you can reverse engineer it, can't you? You can tell it what you want to end up with, and it will work it out for you backwards.
Yeah, and then you'll probably be in for a slight shock, but then you can always work forward from there with something that's actually realistic. Because the reality is you've got to have something realistic.
Good stuff. So that's done for another week. And I did say and promised last week that if anybody reviewed the podcast, we'd read it out this week. But none of you have.
Yeah, which is, I think, it's shameful that none of you even bothered to leave a podcast after all this work. So
blood, sweat and tears.
Yep. So I'm the first person. I tell you what, everybody who leaves a podcast review this week will get a mug, and they will get on the mug wall of fame.
Hang on, wait, whoa, wind that back. Everyone that does a review on the podcast this week is going to get a mug. You're going to stick to that. What if we get 50 reviews?
We're going to have to find 50 mugs. We will do it. So we will. Everybody this week, by next week's show, and we record it. Then if they've done it, they'll get a mug.
Have you thought this through?
Not really. I just came up with that on a whim, and I can see Lauren behind us looking, thinking, what's he just promised? But hey.
Good stuff. If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. The Twitter address is @moneytothemasses with number 2. Check us out on Instagram. We've got lots and lots on YouTube as well. Check out our YouTube channel. And please do subscribe to our YouTube channel because we're creating new content. There's 2 or 3 videos going up there every week. We've got the Midweek Markets podcast from Damien where you can actually watch him record the podcast. You can see his face. And also we've got Millennial Money that's hosted by Lauren. And sneak preview, this week's Millennial Money video is going to feature 4 Money to the Masses presenters.
Yep, 4. There you go.
Until next time.
Until next time.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.